So today we're addressing the second theme in our series, Dance is Us. And the theme this week is F for Future. And I just want to start this interview with the thought that artists are very often the drivers of change. And yet I don't think we've faced a situation such as this, where the global cultural sector is simultaneously facing a loss of a monumental scale. So what arises from this in terms of creation and new models for presentation will certainly be interesting to witness and to be a part of. But that's all in an uncertain future. And this is what everyone's talking about at the moment, this uncertainty, even though the future was never certain. So some of the biggest questions we're now facing are addressing how we will adapt and stay relevant and continue to be the drivers of change. So for today's conversation, I'm really excited to welcome Toni Attard and Elaine Falzon and Paolo Mangiola. So just to give you an introduction to those speakers, Toni was the first Director of Strategy at Arts Council Malta, where he led the team which created and developed the Council's Create 2020 strategy. He's also served as Creative Economy Advisor within the Ministry of Finance, Economy and Investment to develop a national strategy for the cultural and creative industries in Malta. He's one of the authors of Malta's Cultural Policy, a visiting lecturer in arts management at the University of Malta, and he's served on numerous EU policy groups and is a regular speaker at international conferences. Elaine Falzon also worked with Arts Council Malta, first as Performing Arts Executive and then as the Head of Funding and Brokerage, where she managed the Arts Council's funding programs. Elaine was also part of that Create 2020 strategy team. In 2018, she joined the National Theatre Company, Teatro Malta. Both Toni and Elaine now run their own independent cultural consultancies. Paolo Mangiola is ZfinMalta's artistic director. Paolo is a choreographer, a dance educator, and a performer working within ballet and contemporary dance practices. As a performer, he's collaborated with and danced for artists and choreographers, including Wayne McGregor, Deborah Hay, Martin Creed, and Mauro Bigonzetti. Paolo was appointed resident choreographer at Balletto di Roma in 2015, where he remained for 3 seasons. And since 2017, he's been artistic director of ZfinMalta, which is Malta's national dance company. So, welcome to everyone. It's lovely to have you here.
It's a pleasure to be with everyone.
Thank you. I'm beginning each interview with the same question, just to set the scene and as a way to address the purpose of these podcasts, which is to reveal the myriad ways in which dance features in our lives, to show that everyone has a relationship with the movement and an experience of dance. So I'm going to ask you, I'll start with Toni. What's your earliest, or if not earliest, most vivid memory of dance?
I can't trace it back to my earliest because probably it would be me in front of a mirror trying to do some form of dance and failing miserably at that. But I recall the discovery, I think, of contemporary dance and entering that world when I was studying at university, when I started, the discovering the world of Pina Bausch, and then later on, so quite late in time, when I actually managed to watch performances. I think the first one would have been like by the Netherlands Dance Theatre, and I remember sitting there and being completely in awe at this absolute beauty and coming to terms with the fact that locally I wasn't really experiencing much of that. Having said that, there were some performances which I can trace back in Malta, taking me to, introducing me to especially contemporary dance, and that's where I kind of fell in love with the genre.
And hopefully stayed with it.
And not only stayed with it, but continued the conversation, which actually led then to the development of ZfinMalta. So
yeah. Great.
That was, yeah.
Elaine?
Yeah, I think in my case, I actually do remember my very first attempt, hollow attempt at dancing, the dancer at all. And I remember very, very young watching Italian TV at that point in time when and trying to imitate the dances I used to see. And I was very young, so I used to just go, against the wall, just put my legs up, and I would think that that's dance, But and obviously my family used to clap and cheer me on, so I don't think that helped very much the whole thing. But yeah, I mean it's a sweet, memory of the first experiences with movement in general. I think this is kind of what makes it interesting, and how we relate with it in very different ways. I mean, obviously, as Toni was saying, then as you grow up, you start watching different performances and encountering different types of dance as you go along. But I think I'm interested in the way how we will relate differently to movement. Let's put it that way. So yeah, that's my very first memory. Now I think I have, like, my tastes are a little bit better. I follow more professional dance, but
Very good. And Paolo, what story do you have for us?
I'll be super brief. My story started when I was young. I had a problem with my liver, and that's where the doctor said to my mom, Paolo should do dance, or he should swim. And my neighbor used to go to ballet school. I was 6 years old, and that's how I started. And that was my very first experience with movement and dance. And I clearly fell in love, because my whole life is dedicated to this art form. And yeah, but it's so nice to hear that everyone has had a relationship and still has a relationship with dance and movement. So again, as you said at the beginning, Nicole, this is the purpose of this podcast. So it's great. It's nice and encouraging. Yeah.
Good. Okay, so now we all have dance on our mind. We're in. But I just want to flip over now in particular to Toni and Elaine. As I've said in the introduction, you both played a very important part in the development and implementation of a national arts strategy for Malta. And this is precisely the type of work that asks you to predict a future, so to speak, even though it's very speculative. So I'm just wondering if you can speak a little about that aspect of your work.
So I was, as you said, I was part of the team when the first strategy for Arts Council was created, together with Toni, in fact. Well, I think it was the type of work which requires a focus and an understanding of the present, with the ability to look towards the future and kind of be able to implement actions or propose actions which can shape it. So it's really an exercise which brings together the past and what we've learned, the present and what we are experiencing, what we are seeing, and the future. Obviously, it was something which, it was an exercise which I think made us reflect also on the situation and on all the things which needed to be done at that point. It was a first attempt, so I think it was a good first attempt, but obviously it's now, as you look back, you start noticing maybe we could have done this, maybe we could have done that, So it's obviously a continuous exercise. So I would say that it was something which was started back then, but which is still ongoing in terms of an analysis, in terms of working on actions, in terms of being flexible. And this is something I think it's a very important point, which is currently very relevant, very on everyone's thoughts, how to be flexible, how to adapt, how to react, how to propose in this kind of scenario. So I think a strategy, obviously working on a strategy requires that, but it also requires a level of flexibility, which now I think we understand and we are more clear about the kind and the level of flexibility which would need to be in place, to be proposed in order for it to be a good strategy, you know?
Yeah. Toni?
I'd like to go back a little bit to 2010. As you mentioned, I worked within the finance ministry to work on the creative economy. And at that time, the rest of the world, or most of the world in a way, was going through the financial crisis, either coming out or actually still going through that. And it was a particularly strange time in a way to be talking about cultural development at a time when all these financial problems were going on. But I could see the patterns emerge there of a cultural sector that, especially those who were completely dependent on public funding, with funding being cut, organizations closing, arts councils losing their own funding. So the warning signs were already there for these kind of situations. And I remember when we worked on the creative economy strategy, and I must admit, quite heavily criticized by the art sector for starting to put in a conversation on sustainability, financial sustainability, thinking of entrepreneurship. And it was a kind of, the approach from our end was to catch up on structures which did not exist, so public funding programs, and at the same time thinking of support mechanisms to support the idea of a creative enterprise. As I said, there was huge resistance. And today we see the result of that, in terms of, had we not had any conversation on professionalization, on having enterprise there, I would probably predict that the fact that incentives set in place, announced by government last week, would not have included the art sector or those in the creative industries. So I would say it took us 10 years to actually put this sector as an important sector from an economic point of view. And I must say that in a way, nobody could predict this sort of future, but you can clearly see these patterns emerge. And I think that, back to, we start talking about resilience, those who will be resilient in the situation are those who are able to navigate both worlds. Yeah. The world of public support and the other structures which are required to support a kind of a sustainable ecology.
Yeah, complete dependency on public funding is always putting you in a very precarious situation. There's no doubt about that. Just moving on, just speaking about, this idea of not being able to foresee these events, even though Toni referred to the financial crisis, and coming in on the back of that, it's interesting that you've given that context. I just wanted to go on to talk about that a little just to bring some more optimism also into this conversation. I just want to refer to a quote from Rebecca Solnit in her book from 2016 called Hope in the Dark, Untold Stories, Wild Possibilities. She says, this is 2016, this is an extraordinary time full of vital, transformative moments that could not be foreseen. It's also a nightmarish time. Full engagement requires the ability to perceive both. This couldn't be more true of the world we're living in and what's happening right now. So what ideas of hope have emerged in your thinking or writing or conversations in recent weeks? And how do you think artists can find agency in this unknown territory? Maybe, Paolo, would you like to respond to that?
Yes, I think I'd like to continue from what Toni just mentioned, is the ability indeed to be resilient. So I guess that's where the artists, they can find their agency. Again, it's a training, and it's something that, some people are born resilient, some others, they become resilient through consistent exposure into difficult environments, or environments that you've got to grow. So I guess for personally for me, it's now a time to kind of have a moment of reflection, of course. And I think we spoke about also with the team at ZfinMalta how we need to, instead of go back into overproducing something, this is indeed a time where we perhaps need to get together and through authentic shared ideas, we can build a more sustainable future, which is already happening in Malta. I'm witnessing that happening. And maybe it's also, like Elaine mentioned, which is the ability to calibrate. Because you see, we do exercises, we do in terms of, we can predict the future, but obviously we can never know what happens. No one was aware that this was going to happen. So maybe next time we can calibrate better and we can prepare ourselves better. The big question for me nowadays is how do we see dance? How do we create dance? What are the platforms for dance? How do we keep working with artists that are freelancers? And then as institutions, do we have the responsibility to provide the room for these freelance artists to keep developing? So all these questions, they become more and more relevant to me. And I'd like to,
Toni or Elaine?
I'd like to build on what Paolo was saying. I mean, something that the immediate thing that has emerged even from the research I conducted is, of course, something which is very difficult to talk about in Malta is the professionalization of the artist in terms of those who earn an income. Mm-hmm. Because of the small size, in a way, and because of the mixed economy that comes into this, it's very difficult to differentiate between those who earn an income and those who don't. Mm-hmm. And from a policy point of view, there are different policies for these, without saying that an amateur artist is of lesser value than another, and et cetera, et cetera. But this situation has immediately put that on the national agenda. So we've been, Elaine and myself have had endless conversations and even funding programs where create, but there was resistance, and there still is a resistance to have this conversation. So that's the first thing that the positive side I look at in terms of what has this led to. What Paolo mentioned, I think, is very, very important in terms of our local, the Maltese ecology is made up of publicly funded institutions, organizations, and independent freelance artists. And we've been, I think, lucky enough to have, for example, organizations like ZfinMalta, like Teatro Malta, who have merged these different, I wouldn't call them different worlds, but actually that they understand that in their work, the work of a freelance artist is, because we shift from this gig economy from one project to another, is important to that program, to that process. And equally so, the freelance artist is seeing that as an important partner that would not just create work, but serve as an important source for creative development. And I suspect that this is not only there to stay, but I suspect this will only grow. And I think this is also being felt across the world, where we are seeing so many public institutions supporting the artists in certain situations where that can happen, and other situations where independent artists are also coming together to react to this situation. So whereas this situation we're in will hopefully be out of it in a couple of months, if not weeks, ideally days, I think the changes which will happen are, whether they're big changes or small changes, but there will be changes, at least in the way we think and the way we can prevent or create structures that would support any other similar situation in the future to be easier.
Yeah, if I can add something onto that, because I think what we're saying here is very important, even in terms of the context which we operate in terms of our creative ecology, the Maltese creative ecology. I think we have to keep in mind here that everything happened so fast in terms of having a number of different public cultural organizations when compared to other countries. Everything, the companies and organizations are quite new, recent, so that in a matter of few years, it kind of created something else within the ecology. The idea of having a professional status is relatively, I would say, new, particularly in some areas more than others, whereas before maybe the opportunities were more in terms in education of that specific art form. Now there is the opportunity to be a professional dancer, to be a professional theatre maker, to be a professional creative practitioner. So I think we have to be a little bit kind to ourselves here and say, and consider the fact that this is all quite recent. Now, that doesn't obviously hinder our thoughts here to kind of to go towards a more positive outlook and say, okay, here is the situation, this is what happened, this is what happened in all the world, so it's kind of, we can share practices, we can learn, we can speak about it, even with our international colleagues, and reflect. This, I think, it gave us, let's call it an opportunity to accelerate a little bit the process and move towards what we were probably thinking of doing, of creating in 5-6 years' time. So Paolo was rightly mentioning the collaboration between public organizations and the independent sector. It's important, and I think it was on our mind. We just were so busy doing projects and working on our own initiatives that we maybe were putting that aside. So yes, I think it's obviously the situation is quite bad, but at the same time, I'm sure that it will lead to good things, such as this one, the opportunity to collaborate a little bit more. So we had the time to stop and say, okay, so there is an independent sector, there are public organizations. Can we work together in a different way? Can we share our resources? Can we share our funds? If we have the funds, we have the expertise, let's work together, let's create something together. We've seen quite a number of initiatives taking place, and I think that is the way forward. So I think that it's the context, makes it. I think we were getting there slowly because it was it all happened so quickly. So we were trying to still figure out how to go about things. But possibly this has kind of moved us quickly into the future.
It's also slowed it. I mean, we've ground to a halt and have the opportunity now to have these really important conversations that you're speaking of, that we weren't finding the time to have before. It's a time for reflection after this, incubation period, if you can call it that. Now we have time to reflect and speak more to each other.
I think if I can mention an actual example, and even Toni can mention this or kind of confirm this, when we had launched the research support grants, that was, I think, some 3 years ago, 4 years ago, something like that. It was very difficult actually to find people, artists, interested in applying for that. What the research grant essentially is the possibility for you to have some time, to have some space for you to work on your ideas, to work on your project. And it was very difficult to actually convince people to stop for a while and work on their arts and, do something, think about their art and think about their project.
Yeah.
So yeah, just everything shifted suddenly.
So just in terms of future sustainability then of the cultural ecosystem, if you look at what's happening, the necessary measures being implemented to combat this crisis globally, they're impacting theatres, museums, venues, cultural heritage sites, cultural centres, and all other cultural and creative spaces. And they're all reliant on audiences, visitors, and participation. So people, human interaction. And add to that the cultural ecosystem, the creators, the professionals, the freelancers, support and technical staff, all the people we've been speaking about who work in these practices. So without appropriate support measures, these decisions will have quite a devastating economic and social impact on the sector. So just briefly, if we could, do you have any ideas? Because I say briefly because I know this is quite a big question. Do you have any ideas about how we can adequately support the sustainability of the cultural ecosystem, similar to what's being planned for businesses, for example?
Well, I wouldn't discard or differentiate between businesses and the cultural sector.
Okay.
There are common needs because culture is also a business for a lot of people. It employs, it creates jobs, it contributes to the economy just like any other. Having said that, there are also specificities of the cultural sector. I always use the example, if it took 100 musicians to play Beethoven's Ninth 100 years ago, it still takes that amount of musicians to do that today. So no market forces can actually change the delivery of that, but the prices have increased to perform that. So I think there are the immediate needs. So let's look at the immediate needs. The fact that the world, I would say, is also testing out the model of universal basic income, for example, which is something I immediately had proposed to say that's our first stopgap solution. This is not about, it's an emergency situation for people who shifted from something to nothing in terms of income. And that probably is going to open up a global conversation of whether universal basic income is going to become a right for every citizen of the world, or for some, which we're seeing happening in other countries. So that's the first thing. There is also an element of reskilling that needs to take place. I noticed, for example, now fine, I'm using as many digital tools as I can, and I operate my own business. But I've realized in the past weeks on how the skills I actually do not have to set up something, an online interactive session, even though so I need to reskill myself. And I always knew that I probably needed these skills, but I kind of kept them on the back burner. Because probably, and this is something there are realities, for example, such as climate change, which this experience will show us how we can still do things and how much we need to do things in a more efficient way. And this is something the arts are already having this kind of conversation. Well, can I tour less? Can I tour in a more efficient way? Can I start international collaboration? Do I need to physically be in the same room with someone to develop an international collaboration? Mm-hmm. So now I'm not saying that these tools were not available, these processes were not available. However, probably people like myself will be definitely rethinking these processes.
Yeah.
Because I know I don't
Paolo, yeah.
Travel. What really makes me think about what Toni just said is that there must be totally a way to rethink how we actually see the sector, and in terms of there has to be a competition, because that's what actually creates a growth. But I suspect we need to absolutely find a different way of dealing with this. So, as an example, the touring, right? Yes, of course, a company to sustain itself has to tour, has to present their works. But then, how are we going to present the work if we need to be much, aware that there is climate change, we can't tour, and perhaps we need to think that we need to create performances for the places where we are. But how are we going to do that if social distancing is the new rule? Again, the reskilling, it's really important. I suspect we really need to radically rethink how we generate growth and how we generate, in our case, how we generate culture and how we create experiences that people can still, address and can take them and enjoy them.
So, Paolo, can I just extending on what you're saying, making reference to the fact that dance is a live art form, and you've mentioned physical or social distancing. Can you go a little bit deeper into how you think that's going to affect dance making or theatre, and where these two, where they might intersect with future audiences? Can you put forward a likely scenario?
I'm observing now, clearly everyone is rushing into using online platforms, but this can't be the solution. Dance is
the whole solution.
No, I can't. I really don't know. I don't know. I can only sit down with you and with like-minded people, other artists, and try to find a solution. That's where crises become interesting and they become an opportunity for change. I don't know. I don't have, unfortunately, I can't predict. I'm in a survival mode at the moment.
Yeah, I think it will be an interesting opportunity now to kind of witness a different type of art, or kind of going back in circle. Now it's going to be, probably we're going to see arts talking in a very general way, talking about issues again, talking about humans again, talking about connections, because when you do not really think about these things, and you're wealthy and you're doing well and you're kind of experiencing a good life, you probably tend to think a little bit less about certain issues. So I think that it's going to change, and it's going to become somewhat more engaged, more like speaking more about connections, about human beings, about what we feel, how we're feeling, how we're experiencing this. I don't know. I'm curious, but I think it could happen.
I do agree. I do think that we're hopefully entering an era of empathy, of global empathy, which should resonate in not just our work, the work of every educator, of every, I think the medical sector is definitely showing us that at this point on how that could be done. I don't think much is going to change from the experience itself. The arts existed before the Spanish flu, continued to exist after the Spanish flu. The arts existed before the war. The arts united the world after the war.
And in fact, the arts can be a very powerful tool in the wake of a crisis or a war, or traditionally or historically, it has been
exactly
focused.
And this is the biggest, and maybe this is why the situation is going to be different, because at the time of economic crisis, funding needed to be cut, and the arts suffered. This may be a bit different, because if there's one thing no government should actually do is reduce funding for arts education in the health sector and sports at this particular day and age, where people need to at some point come together physically, and the arts will not replace. No social online festival is actually going to replace that particular experience. It's equally another experience. So I don't think it's a situation of either or. So should we see more online content be created specifically for online work? Yes. Should it be valued more? Yes. Should there be ways on how to pay for it? Definitely yes. But it's not one thing or another. I think more value and support needs to be given on how to actually translate this into an online, because let's be frank. How many museums have opened in the past 2 weeks of shows have been online? we're trying to replicate that consumption model in the same way. I haven't yet had the time to sit down and go to any of these virtual museums. So equally like us, there are hundreds and thousands and millions of people out there saying, it's great, it's there, but what do I do with it now? So, you know, we also need to understand that if there is an issue of overconsumption, and that overconsumption or overproduction has simply shifted online, we're really not addressing the problem there, which has nothing to do with coronavirus, has nothing to do with issues of social or physical distancing. It has got to do with the sector itself.
I think now we need an artistic director and an artistic programmer for online content.
Probably.
That's what happens. You have an overload of content, and then you need to find a way to make that content more relevant. You need to edit.
Indeed, now we are again overreacting to something like this, and I guess it's a coping strategy. We are trying to put everything out there because clearly we have no idea how to manage the situation. And I think, as we mentioned before, then there must be we need to reassess how we see profit, to reassess how we see growth, and maybe really change the system in the way it was before. And I think, again, this is a good moment. And I really do hope that arts organizations, they are, as always, the pioneering ones, the ones that they pave the way and they show examples and models.
Yeah, and I think that we already start seeing these kind of trends emerging as well. And what I find really inspiring is that I also see, in terms from a cultural leadership point of view, those who have already experienced resilience, people who live in situations where this is just yet another lockdown, for people who have been experiencing, and artists living in difficult conditions of war, of poverty, so, you know, I'm speaking here from a privileged position as well, in experiencing a crisis probably for the first time in my life. Yeah. And probably so I definitely can't teach much out. I actually just have to sit back and listen and allow the voices from all these places who are really able to navigate through this with such ease and beauty, that actually the rest of the world, most of the Western world, needs to just shut up a little bit and listen and learn from others. Yeah.
Perhaps that's a note to end on. I mean, I was hoping to end this discussion by just drawing us back to the idea of dance, because that is what's brought us together. And this program, Dances Us, aims to show the relevance of dance, not only as a vital art form for our time, but also as a universal language, you know, as an experience everyone's entitled to have. So if you could just, you know, bring yourselves back into your bodies and think about movement and dance, and how much you might be sort of missing that in the very near future. Do you have anything to say about what we can do to keep this message alive? How do we keep dance alive in this time? In this time of lockdown? I
don't think the arts are not far from asleep or dead, or they are alive. Maybe, you know, it's like, to me, it's similar to when as a theater director myself, I did not direct theater for 3 years, but it in no way did that mean that I stopped thinking about it, or that I did not allow that space to be my creative space to think about it. So and maybe Paolo, but I'm sure he never stopped thinking about dance here. And I'm sure, you know, this space is going to lead to some, you know, try in a positive way, to some very interesting creative modes. Let's never forget the fact that the arts always thrive in the midst of a crisis. Always. Yeah. I mean, this was my running joke, to be perfectly honest, when people tell me, but why are the arts in Malta so kind of not so easy in terms of we're not questioning much. And I kept on saying, you know, all we need is a crisis, because a crisis will get us out of this and we start doing things which are maybe more radical. You know, is this the opportunity we have? Then let's take it.
Well, thank you for giving us that opportunity. Now we can all blame you.
No, please.
I really think, just as a last comment from my end, that as I said before, and as Toni was saying, kind of it could be an opportunity to have to speak about other things, to focus on what makes us human beings, on what defines us, on what pushes us forward, on how we miss connections and how we are connecting in different ways. I think dance is also about that. It's about the human being. It's about how we connect with each other. So I think that, well, this is a pause. Yes, this has made us reflect, definitely. And it will be something which possibly could, you know, take us somewhere else, or else keep us here, but in different ways. So it's an opportunity for sure.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Paolo, do you have any closing comment?
No, I don't want to take too much time. I just, I just wish to keep moving and to move people, and people at home and people that are not at home, people that are in this moment, they're clearly in a big mess, to just, again, perhaps move with your imagination. Movement is really, it's everywhere. It's how we experience the world. It's every single, you know, it's part of life. And, you know, if there's movement, there's life. So let's just keep moving.
Yeah, I think this forced isolation is waking us up to this idea of missing, you know, we're missing human contact, we're missing nature, we're missing being in public spaces. So when we're through this, you know, as Elaine was talking about, sort of getting back to that basic, you know, what it is to be human and to connect with our environment and our place and our land, this beautiful landscape we live in. So thank you, everyone, for your comments today, for joining us. It's been...
Hello?
Oh, we're losing our connection here. So just to conclude...
Nicole?